Hey everyone, tonight we're diving into a story most people have never heard, what it was really like to be a Christian in the Soviet Union. Not the version from textbooks, but the harsh reality of faith under a regime that tried to erase it. Now get comfortable, and let's begin. It's 1925 in Moscow. You wake up before dawn, not because you want to, but because you have to. And being late isn't just frowned upon, it's reported. But before you face another day of building the glorious socialist future, you do something that could get you killed. You pray. You don't pray loudly. You don't even whisper. You mouth the words silently, because even the walls have ears in Soviet Russia. Your neighbors, your co-workers, even your own children have been taught that reporting religious activity is their patriotic duty, and the reward for turning in a believer, extra rations, better housing, maybe even a promotion. Welcome to life as a Christian in communist Russia, where your faith isn't just discouraged, it's considered a mental illness. Where churches aren't just closed, they're dynamited. Where priests aren't just arrested, they're tortured until they renounce God himself. This isn't a story about politics or ideology. This is a story about survival, about ordinary people who chose to believe in something greater than the state and paid a price so horrific that most of us can't even imagine it. You think you know persecution? You think you understand what it means to have your faith tested? Brother, sister, you're about to discover what happens when an entire government machine turns its fury against the cross. And spoiler alert, you wouldn't last a day. The Bolsheviks didn't just want to change Russia's government. They wanted to change its soul, and that meant declaring war on God himself. Lenin called religion the opium of the people, but that was actually being generous. To the Communist Party, Christianity wasn't just a drug, it was a virus, a dangerous infection that prevented the Soviet people from achieving true revolutionary consciousness. And just like any virus, it had to be eradicated completely. Sounds almost polite, doesn't it? Like they were just trying to educate people out of some harmless superstitions. The reality was a systematic assault on everything Christians held sacred. Churches were the first target. Not just closed, but converted into museums of atheism, grain warehouses, or community centres where communist youth groups would meet. The beautiful Orthodox churches that had stood for centuries with their golden domes and ancient icons were stripped of everything valuable. Icons weren't just removed, they were publicly burned while crowds cheered. Church bells, some weighing tons and cast with donations from generations of faithful believers, were melted down to make tractors and weapons. But the buildings were just the beginning. The real target was the people themselves. Every priest, every monk, every nun was now an enemy of the state. They were given a choice that wasn't really a choice at all. Renounce your faith publicly or face the consequences. And those consequences? Arrest, exile to the gulags, or execution. Here's what gets me about this whole thing. The Soviets didn't just want Christians to stop believing. They wanted them to admit they had been wrong. They wanted public confessions, written statements declaring that God was a lie and that the Communist Party was humanity's true salvation. Some priests did it, some broke under the pressure and signed whatever papers were put in front of them. And who can blame them? When the alternative is watching your family starve or disappear in the middle of the night, when the choice is between your principles and your children's lives, what would you do? But here's the thing that still gives me chills when I think about it. Most of them didn't break. Most of them chose death over denial. And that choice, that incredible, terrifying choice, is what this whole story is really about. The Communist Party understood something that a lot of people today seem to have forgotten. Ideas have power. Beliefs shape reality. And if you want to control a population completely, you can't just control their bodies. You have to control their souls. That's why they didn't stop at closing churches. They created an entire parallel universe designed to replace God with the state, communist youth groups for children, mandatory atheism classes in schools, public ceremonies celebrating Soviet heroes instead of saints. They even created their own version of communion, where instead of bread and wine representing the body and blood of Christ, children would share bread and milk, representing the bounty of the socialist state. It sounds almost comical when you describe it like that, but it wasn't funny to the millions of Christians who watched their entire world being systematically dismantled and replaced with something cold, mechanical, and utterly without transcendence. And the scariest part? For a lot of people, it worked. By 1925, just 3 years after the campaign began, church attendance in major Soviet cities had dropped by over 80%. Seminary schools were closed. Religious publishing was banned. The machinery of faith that had sustained Russian civilization for 1,000 years was being torn apart piece by piece, bolt by bolt, prayer by prayer. But here's what the communists didn't count on. Faith doesn't live in buildings. It doesn't depend on priests or ceremonies or public displays of devotion. Faith lives in the human heart. And the human heart, it turns out, is a lot harder to break than they thought. So as the official church crumbled, something else began to grow in its place. Something hidden, dangerous, and absolutely unstoppable. The underground church was being born, and it would prove to be more resilient than any cathedral ever built. Because when you can't worship in public, you learn to worship in secret. When you can't trust your neighbours, you learn to trust your God. And when the state tries to replace your saviour, you discover just how deep your faith really goes. But surviving the initial purge was only the beginning. Because even if you managed to keep your faith hidden, even if you whispered your prayers and buried your icons, the Soviet system had ways of finding you. They didn't just want to destroy the church buildings, they wanted to destroy the very idea of God inside your head. And they were very, very good at it. The Soviets understood something most people don't. You can't just ban religion and expect it to disappear. You have to replace it with something else, something bigger, something more appealing, something that promises the same comfort and community that faith provides. So they gave the people a new religion, the religion of the state. Lenin himself declared that the Communist Party would become the new church. Marx's writings became the new scriptures. The revolution became the new salvation story. And the state, well, the state became God. They even had their own saints. Lenin's body was mummified and displayed in a tomb that looked suspiciously like a shrine. People would line up for hours just to glimpse his preserved corpse, bowing their heads in reverence. If that's not religious worship, I don't know what is. But the real genius was how they targeted the children. Because the Soviets knew that if you could capture the minds of the young, you could control the future. So they created something called the Young Pioneers. Think of it as communist Sunday school, except instead of learning about Jesus, kids learned about the glorious revolution. Instead of singing hymns, they chanted party slogans. Instead of Bible stories, they heard tales of heroic communist martyrs who died fighting the evil capitalists. And here's the truly insidious part. They made it fun. The Young Pioneers had camps, games, songs, ceremonies, uniforms. Everything that made church appealing to children, except the message was completely different. Your parents might whisper about Jesus at home, but at school, you were surrounded by friends who believed in Lenin. Which voice do you think was louder? The propaganda was everywhere. In schools, children learned that religion was a disease, a mental illness that kept people from achieving their full potential. Science textbooks didn't just explain evolution, they actively mocked the idea of creation. History lessons portrayed the church as an enemy of progress, a tool used by the rich to keep the poor in line. And if you were a Christian parent watching your child come home from school spouting atheist talking points, what could you do? Complain to the teacher? That was a one-way ticket to a labour camp. Try to counter the propaganda at home? Your own child might report you to the authorities. The Soviets had turned families against each other, using children as informants against their own parents. This wasn't accidental. This was psychological warfare, carefully planned and ruthlessly executed. The state wasn't just competing with the church for people's loyalty, it was systematically dismantling the very foundations of religious thought. And for most people, it worked. Within a generation, church attendance had plummeted from nearly universal to practically non-existent in many areas. But here's what the Soviets didn't count on. Faith, real faith, doesn't live in buildings or books or ceremonies. It lives in the human heart. And the human heart, it turns out, is remarkably stubborn. Because even as the official church crumbled, even as the priests disappeared and the icons were destroyed, something else began to emerge. Something the state couldn't control, couldn't monitor, couldn't crush. The underground church. Picture this. It's 1935, somewhere in rural Ukraine. The local Orthodox church has been converted into a grain storage facility. The priest was arrested 3 years ago and never came back. The crosses have been melted down for scrap metal. Officially, Christianity in this village is dead. But on certain nights, if you know where to look, you might notice something strange. A light flickering in someone's basement. Voices, barely audible, rising and falling in an ancient rhythm. Because in that basement, in complete secrecy, a dozen believers have gathered to worship. They have no priest, so the oldest man leads the service from memory. They have no icons, so they close their eyes and imagine the face of Christ. They have no Bible, so they recite the verses they remember, passing down the words like precious heirlooms. This was the reality for millions of Christians throughout the Soviet era. Church didn't happen in cathedrals anymore. It happened in living rooms, in barns, in forests, in any place where believers could gather without being seen. They called these secret congregations the catacomb church, and they were everywhere. The logistics alone were mind-bending. How do you organize a religious service when any two Christians meeting together could be considered a conspiracy? How do you spread the word about a gathering without using phones, letters, or any form of communication the state might intercept? How do you trust someone enough to invite them to your secret church when that same person might be an informant? The answer was networks. Carefully constructed, painfully tested networks of trust that spread like invisible webs across the country. A baker might slip a coded message into a loaf of bread. A farmer might leave chalk marks on fence posts to signal a meeting. A grandmother might teach her grandchildren Bible stories disguised as fairy tales, keeping the faith alive through the most innocent voices. And the courage these people showed was absolutely staggering. Because they knew the risks. They'd seen what happened to believers who got caught. Prison camps in Siberia, where the cold could kill you faster than the guards. Psychiatric hospitals, where they'd pump you full of drugs to cure your religious delusion. Labour camps, where you'd work 16-hour days until your body simply gave out. But they gathered anyway. They prayed anyway. They sang hymns in whispers, shared communion with stale bread and watered-down wine, and baptized their children in rivers and bathtubs when no one was watching. Because for them, the alternative wasn't just losing their faith, it was losing their souls. The state responded with increasing paranoia. They planted spies in every workplace, every neighborhood, every apartment building. They offered rewards for information about religious gatherings. They encouraged children to inform on their parents, wives to betray their husbands, neighbors to report each other for the slightest sign of religious activity. And it worked to a degree. Countless believers were arrested, tortured, and killed. Families were torn apart, communities were shattered. The visible church, the institutional church, was effectively destroyed. But the invisible church, the church that existed in hearts and minds and secret gatherings, that proved to be indestructible. Because here's the thing about trying to kill an idea. The harder you squeeze, the more it slips through your fingers. Every arrested believer became a martyr whose story inspired others. Every closed church became a symbol of resistance. Every child raised in atheist schools who still somehow found their way to faith became proof that the human spirit cannot be completely controlled. The Soviets thought they were waging war against buildings and books and rituals, but they were actually fighting something much more dangerous. They were fighting hope. And hope, as it turns out, is the one thing that totalitarian regimes can never quite manage to kill. Because even in the darkest moments, even when it seemed like faith had been completely erased from Soviet soil, somewhere in a basement or a forest clearing or a grandmother's kitchen, believers were gathering. They were praying. They were remembering. They were keeping alive something that the state insisted was dead. And that, more than any theological argument or philosophical debate, was the real victory of faith under communism. Not that it survived intact, but that it survived at all. That despite 70 years of systematic persecution, despite every tool of oppression the modern world had to offer, the flame never quite went out. It flickered, it dimmed, it seemed to disappear entirely at times, but it never died. And when the Soviet Union finally collapsed in 1991, when the walls came down and the churches could finally open their doors again, millions of believers emerged from the shadows, not broken, not defeated, but ready to rebuild what had been destroyed. That's the power of faith that the Soviets never understood. You can destroy the buildings, silence the priests, burn the books, and terrorize the believers, but you cannot kill what lives in the human heart. You cannot arrest an idea whose time has come, and you cannot build a paradise on earth by declaring war on heaven. The communist experiment in Russia lasted 70 years. The church they tried to destroy has lasted 2000. As the 1930s ground on, the machinery of Soviet oppression didn't just target priests and bishops. It came for everyone. Your neighbour who crossed herself before meals, the old woman who whispered prayers in the bread line, the father who taught his children about God when the authorities weren't looking. Because here's the thing about totalitarian regimes. They don't stop at the obvious targets. They keep digging until they've rooted out every last trace of what they're trying to destroy. And Stalin was nothing if not thorough. By 1937, the Great Terror was in full swing. This wasn't just political purges anymore. This was spiritual warfare on an industrial scale. Show trials became theatre. Confessions were extracted through methods that would make medieval inquisitors blush. And the charges? Counter-revolutionary activity, espionage for the Vatican, conspiracy against the state. But really, it all boiled down to one thing: believing in something bigger than the Communist Party. Here's what they didn't tell you in history class. The Soviets weren't just executing people. They were systematically documenting and cataloguing every act of faith, every whispered prayer, every hidden icon. They turned persecution into a science, files upon files of evidence that someone, somewhere, still believed in God despite everything the state had done to crush that belief. And you know what's terrifying? How efficient they became at it. Take Father Pavel Florensky, brilliant theologian, scientist, mathematician, the kind of mind that comes along once in a generation. The Soviets arrested him in 1933, shipped him to the Solovetsky labor camp, a former monastery turned into hell on earth, and worked him to death. But before they killed him, they made him write reports on the local geology, scientific papers. They squeezed every drop of usefulness out of him before discarding him like a broken tool. That's the Soviet way. Nothing wasted, everything calculated, even murder. But here's where the story gets really dark. By the late 1930s, they weren't just targeting obvious believers anymore. They were going after their children, kids who'd been raised in secret faith, baptized in kitchen sinks, taught prayers in whispered bedtime stories. The NKVD had informants in schools, watching for any sign that a child might have been contaminated by religious thinking. Imagine being 8 years old and having to choose between betraying your parents or betraying the state. That's the choice they forced on these kids, and many of them, God help them, chose survival. The numbers from this period are staggering. 5 million people. How many of those were believers? We'll never know the exact count. The Soviets were meticulous record keepers, but they weren't advertising their war against God. They buried those statistics deeper than they buried their victims. And speaking of burial, that became its own form of persecution. No Christian funerals, no last rites, no proper graves with crosses or prayers. Bodies dumped in mass graves, mixed with criminals and political prisoners, denied even the dignity of death according to their faith. But here's what's remarkable. What the commissars and the secret police and all of Stalin's apparatus couldn't quite grasp. Faith doesn't die when you kill the faithful. It adapts, it evolves, it finds new ways to survive. By the late 1930s, something extraordinary was happening in the Soviet Union. The institutional church was gone, yes. The priests were dead or in hiding. The buildings were converted to museums of atheism or grain storage. But in apartments and basements, in forest clearings and abandoned cellars, a new kind of Christianity was being born. They called it the catacomb church. And it was unlike anything the world had ever seen. These weren't your grandfather's Orthodox services. There were no golden vestments, no elaborate iconostasies, no choirs singing ancient hymns. This was Christianity stripped down to its absolute essence. A few believers gathered in secret, sharing bread and wine smuggled from who knows where, speaking prayers so quietly they could barely hear themselves. They developed their own language of faith, codes and signals and hidden meanings. A particular pattern of knocks on a door, children's games that were actually prayers in disguise. They turned survival into sacrament. The communion services were heartbreaking and beautiful at the same time. Imagine celebrating the Last Supper, knowing that any one of the people around that table might be arrested before morning. Knowing that the bread you're sharing might be the last meal you eat as a free person. Knowing that the wine, if you could even find wine, might be mixed with tears of fear and desperate hope. And they kept the traditions alive in the most ingenious ways. Orthodox Easter, the holiest day of the Christian calendar, became an underground celebration. Families would gather in different apartments each year, moving the location to avoid detection. They'd bake traditional Easter bread in small batches, hide painted eggs in coat pockets, pass coloured scarves as secret signals that Christ had risen. The baptisms were particularly moving. Picture this, a baby being baptised in a kitchen sink at 3 a.m, while someone stood watch at the window. The parents whispering the ancient words while their hands shook with terror. The godparents chosen not for their social status, but for their willingness to die protecting this child's secret. Because that's what it was, a secret that could get everyone killed. And yet they did it anyway, again and again and again. The catacomb church wasn't just surviving, it was creating its own theology of resistance. These believers developed a spiritual framework that said suffering wasn't just inevitable, it was holy. That persecution wasn't a sign that God had abandoned them, but proof that their faith mattered enough to threaten the most powerful empire on earth. They turned martyrdom into a daily practice. Not the dramatic kind with stakes and lions, but the quiet kind. The kind where you risk everything just to cross yourself when no one's looking. Where teaching your child to pray becomes an act of rebellion. Where keeping a hidden icon becomes a declaration of war against the state. And here's the thing that would have driven Stalin absolutely insane if he'd understood it. They were winning. Not in any way that showed up in statistics or reports, but in the only way that really mattered. They were keeping the flame alive. Because 40 years later, when Gorbachev's reforms began to crack open the Soviet system, when churches started reopening and priests began emerging from decades of hiding, where do you think the new believers came from? They didn't materialize out of thin air. They were the children and grandchildren of the catacomb church, raised on whispered prayers and hidden faith, ready to reclaim what their ancestors had died protecting. The underground believers had done something the Soviet state, for all its power and brutality and scientific atheism, couldn't prevent. They'd passed the torch from hand to hand, heart to heart, generation to generation, in defiance of everything the Communist Party stood for. And that, right there, is why you wouldn't have lasted a day as a Christian in communist Russia. Not because of the obvious dangers, the arrests and executions and labour camps, but because of the impossible choice it forced on every believer: abandon your faith or become a ghost in your own life. Most people, understandably, chose survival. They went through the motions of Soviet citizenship, raised their children to be good communists, and buried their beliefs so deep they sometimes forgot they were there. But some, not many, but some, chose differently. They chose to become the catacomb church, to live as secret keepers of an outlawed truth, to risk everything for the right to believe in something beyond the state. The Soviet machine had done its work with brutal efficiency. Churches reduced to rubble, priests scattered to the winds or buried in unmarked graves, holy books burned in massive bonfires that lit the winter sky. By the 1940s, it seemed the Bolsheviks had achieved the impossible. They had killed God in Russia, or so they thought. But faith, it turns out, is like water. Suppress it in one place, and it finds another way to flow. Destroy the churches and believers create new ones, in basements, in forests, in the quiet corners of their hearts. The Soviet Union had crushed institutional Christianity. What they couldn't crush was the human soul's hunger for something greater than the state. Underground churches began to form almost immediately after the first wave of persecution. Not grand cathedrals with golden domes, but secret gatherings in abandoned barns, hidden cellars, and remote wilderness clearings. These weren't churches in any traditional sense. They were acts of resistance disguised as prayer circles. The believers who gathered in these shadow congregations understood the stakes. Discovery meant imprisonment, exile, or death. Yet they came anyway, drawn by something stronger than fear. They sang hymns in whispers. They baptized their children in frozen rivers under cover of darkness. They passed down scripture memorized word for word, because possessing a Bible could cost you everything. These underground Christians developed their own elaborate networks of communication. A particular way of hanging laundry might signal a meeting. A specific arrangement of stones by a well could indicate danger. Children learned Bible verses disguised as folk songs. Communion wine was hidden in medicine bottles. Sacred texts were copied by hand on scraps of paper and sewn into coat linings. The Soviet authorities knew these gatherings existed, but hunting them down was like trying to catch smoke. Arrest one group and 3 more would spring up elsewhere. Infiltrate a cell, and the believers would simply disappear and reconstitute somewhere else. The underground church wasn't an organisation. It was an organism, alive and adaptive. What's remarkable is how these secret believers maintained their traditions across generations. Grandmothers whispered Bible stories to grandchildren as bedtime tales. Fathers taught sons to recognize other Christians through subtle signs and coded language. Mothers preserved recipes for communion, bread that could pass as ordinary food if discovered. The underground church became a parallel society within Soviet society. They had their own informal clergy, men and women who risked everything to perform marriages, conduct funerals, and offer spiritual guidance. They developed their own theological schools, taught in secret by elderly priests who had survived the purges. They even created their own system of charitable giving, quietly supporting families whose breadwinners had been arrested for their faith. During World War II, when Stalin briefly relaxed religious restrictions to boost morale, some underground churches cautiously emerged from hiding. But they learned quickly that the Soviet leopard hadn't changed its spots. The moment the war ended, persecution resumed with renewed vigour. Those who had revealed themselves were marked for destruction. The believers retreated even deeper underground. They became more careful, more disciplined, more devoted. The constant threat of discovery forged their faith like steel in a furnace. Every prayer was precious because it might be their last. Every gathering was sacred because it defied an empire. What sustained these underground Christians wasn't just belief but community. In a society where neighbours informed on neighbours and children betrayed parents, the secret church offered something revolutionary: unconditional love. Here, a factory worker and a former nobleman could kneel side by side. Here, Russian and Ukrainian and Georgian believers could worship together when their ethnic groups were being pitted against each other by Soviet propaganda. The underground church also preserved more than just religious doctrine. It kept alive ideas that the Soviet system desperately wanted to eradicate: individual worth beyond state utility, moral authority higher than party doctrine, the radical notion that some things were more important than survival itself. These hidden congregations developed their own martyrs and saints. People like Father Dmitri, who conducted secret services in the Siberian wilderness until he froze to death during a winter baptism, or Babushka Vera, who spent 30 years copying scripture by hand and distributing it through a network of brave women. Their names weren't recorded in official histories, but they lived on in whispered prayers and remembered stories. The children raised in these underground communities grew up with a dual identity. In school, they recited communist slogans and praised Stalin. At home, they learned that there was a truth deeper than politics, a love stronger than fear, a hope that no earthly power could extinguish. This constant code switching created a generation of believers who understood both the price of faith and its value. As decades passed, the underground church evolved and adapted. During the Khrushchev thaw of the 1960s, some groups cautiously tested the boundaries of what was possible. When Brezhnev cracked down again in the 1970s, they retreated but didn't disappear. Each generation learned from the previous one's mistakes and victories. By the 1980s, underground Christianity in the Soviet Union had become something unique in world history. A faith community that had survived 7 decades of systematic persecution, not by compromising or hiding, but by transforming. They had learned to be Christian in ways their ancestors never imagined. To find God not in magnificent buildings, but in human hearts. To see miracles not in grand spectacles, but in simple survival. When Gorbachev's reforms finally allowed religious freedom, in the late 1980s, the underground church faced its strangest challenge yet: coming back into the light. Some groups struggled with the transition. After generations of secrecy, public worship felt almost sacrilegious. Some underground communities chose to remain hidden, convinced that persecution would return. But for those who did emerge, the reunion with global Christianity was profound. Western visitors were amazed to discover believers who had preserved ancient traditions thought lost, liturgies that hadn't been heard in public for 70 years, theological insights forged in the crucible of suffering, a depth of faith that left a comfortable Western Christians feeling shallow by comparison. The underground church's greatest victory wasn't just survival, it was transformation. They had taken the worst that human ideology could throw at them and emerged not just intact, but refined. They proved that faith could not only endure persecution, but could be purified by it. That love could grow stronger under pressure. That hope could flourish in the darkest places. Today, as you sit in whatever freedom you enjoy, remember this. Somewhere in communist Russia, a grandmother risked her life to teach a child to pray. A father chose exile rather than renounce his faith. A mother hid scripture in her heart when books were burned. They kept the flame alive not because it was easy, but because they understood what you might have forgotten. That some things are worth dying for. That truth doesn't disappear just because tyrants declare it illegal. That the human soul, when connected to something eternal, becomes indestructible. The underground church of Soviet Russia didn't just survive persecution, it demonstrated something that every dictator fears and every free person should remember, that there are chambers of the human heart where no earthly power can reach. And in those chambers, no matter how dark the world becomes, the light never goes out.